In this video, we'll be introducing the concept of an RC circuit. So what is an RC circuit? Well, we'll be having similar acronyms for different types of circuits. And what we'll be doing is we'll listing the types of components, the type of circuit elements, by the symbol for their relevant property. So what I mean is R stands for resistors with resistance, L stands for capacitors with capacitance, which is capital C. So this is a resistor capacitor circuit. It has resistors and capacitors both together in that circuit. You sometimes have batteries in there too, that can be or cannot be included, but it's saying that so basically any other type of element, the only types of elements in the circuit are going to be resistors, capacitors, and potentially batteries. Note the light bulbs in many ways act as resistors, so sometimes they throw light bulbs in there too, but these are really the only circuit elements you'll have. So the circuit to the right is an example of a RC circuit. So there are two basic processes we're going to look at for RC circuits, and that's going to be for charging and discharging capacitors. Because here's why. Capacitors charge up as current continues to flow. So at some point it'll eventually, and as it charges up, current becomes harder and harder to put more electrons onto one of these plates, which slows down the current. So eventually what will happen if you run current long enough is that these capacitors will just act like a break in the circuit, and then current won't be able to flow in that path. So what we'll have is it'll stop the current wherever you have a capacitor. So in the long term, it's not particularly interesting to look at the behavior of RC circuits. If we, in all these cases, if this simplest diagram, if you if we looked at this after a while, there'll be no current flowing, nothing interesting happening, whether or not there's a bad battery in there or not. But what's interesting is the transitory behavior. What happens in the short term before it slowed down to a stop? And there's basically going to be two different versions of this. Either where there's continuing to gain more charge on the capacitor, which is called charging a capacitor, or where charge is leaving the capacitor, which is called discharging a capacitor. So this is the kind of canonical picture we'll have for a discharging capacitor. What we have here is two circuit elements, a capacitor and a resistor. Now note, this could be an equivalent capacitor and equivalent resistor, so you could have a much more complicated set of capacitors and resistors that are all been lumped together, but this is the basic picture we'll be looking at. And in this case, we'll have some initial charge that we'll have put on the capacitor, and what's happening is that the capacitor wants to redump that charge back onto the other plate. The positive want to go to where the negatives are and vice versa. And so current is going to flow back around from one side of the capacitor into the other side, back to where it'd like to be. And we'll describe that process. For a charging capacitor, you have a capacitor that starts out typically without any charge on either of the plates, but you've hooked it up to a battery, and then the battery would like to flow current in the circuit. It's going to build up charge on the capacitor until there's so much charge on there that it creates a voltage difference across the capacitor, which is stopping the flow of current. And when we look at these two processes, we are going to ask a couple of main questions. The main one's going to be how long does this process take and what variables affect that time. And in terms of keeping track of these changes, we want to look at how does the current change over the time and how the voltage changes over time. And also how does the current, how does the charge on on the capacitor change over time. Now note that that's proportional to the voltage change, so with using the definition of capacitance, so the bottom question of knowing the voltage change is going to be an easy step to find the charge, but these are the main questions we're going to be asking, and in the next section we're going to start answering them.